I believe that we have most of our participants inside the hall, so we will now begin the special session titled Changes in the International Order and the Future of Northern Economic Cooperation in the Post-COVID-19 World. So Chairman Goohoon, the chairman of the Presidential Committee on Northern Economic Cooperation, will start the session for us. Just to give you an introduction, Chairman Kwon was a resident representative of the IMF in Ukraine and Russia, and also a senior economist and strategist with ABN AMRO in London, and he covered the regions of Turkey, Russia, and Kazakhstan. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chairman Kwon.
Thank you. Welcome to the special session on the international order and the future of Northern Economic Cooperation in the post-pandemic world. It is a great honor and privilege to open this first session of the conference with four distinguished panelists. For the next 1 hour, we will discuss issues around three questions. First, how does the pandemic reshape the international order, which seems to show already some signs of instability? Second, what are the social and economic challenges ahead of us in the wake of the global pandemic? Third, what could the global community to do promote economic cooperation across Northeast Asia in the face of a changing international order? Before getting started, a brief introduction of our panelists here on the screen. I will be very brief since they do not need a lengthy introduction. Our first speaker will be Secretary Albright, quote, one of the most admired and energetic public servants in the world. She served as the Secretary of State under the Clinton administration, the first female Secretary of State, and prior to that, the U.S. Ambassador to the UN. She currently teaches at the Georgetown University, SFS, School of Foreign Services. She also holds numerous leadership positions, including in Albright Stonebridge Group, Albright Capital Management, and the National Democratic Institute. She's also a member of the Defense Policy Board of U.S. Department of Defense. Secretary Albright is also an inspiring author of with many bestsellers, including the latest memoir called published this year with the title Hell and Other Destination, which is an intriguing title. Very intriguing title. We are extremely fortunate to have a chance to hear directly from her on her insight, perspective, and advice. Our second speaker is Dr. Paul Krugman, one of the top economists of our time. Currently, he's a distinguished scholar of the City University of New York and taught previously in Princeton, MIT, Yale, and Stanford. And I recall seeing him as a young student in many seminars a long time ago at Harvard, including on trade and geography. He's also Nobel laureate in economics for his work on international trade, which makes him a perfect fit, in our view, to our session on international order and economic cooperation. He's also a prolific writer, including yesterday's New York Times opinion column with a very conspicuous title. You can find out in the website what the title is. We are very thrilled to hear from him today. Hopefully, some good news as well. Professor Seong, yes, is a Deputy Director General of the Institute of American Studies and the Professor of Graduate School of Chinese Academy of Social Science. He got PhD in economics in Nankai University, Tianjin, and was a visiting scholar of Columbia University. Professor Seong focused on trade and the investment issues, especially on the role of multinational companies in developing countries like China. We are very excited to hear his views on the modality and the areas of economic cooperation in the region. Finally, Chairman Dubrovkovich is leading the Sokolov Foundation in Moscow, non-profit organization which focuses on innovation and entrepreneurship. He has taken various positions in the Russian government, more than 20 years, including Minister of Finance and the Minister of Economic Development, and served as Deputy Prime Minister almost 6 years. He is also a well-known economist who led the expert group for the president about 20 years ago, which I had opportunity to interact with while I lived in Moscow, although I'm not sure he remembers me still. We are very grateful that he has agreed to join the panel at the very early morning in Moscow, which is 5 a.m., if I'm not mistaken. Thank you. Without further ado, let's begin with the Secretary Albright for a talk on a 21st century international agenda. Please.
Thank you, Chairman.
위원장님, 소개 말씀 감사드립니다. 그리고 북방경제협력위원회 위원장으로서 리더십을 보여주신 데 대해서
for inviting me to be here. I'm so very pleased to participate in this event alongside Dr. Paul Krugman and the other distinguished panelists whose insights I look forward to hearing. I'm speaking to you from my home in Washington, D.C., where I have been under self-imposed isolation for the last 7 months. During that time, I have watched with some mixture of admiration and envy as the Republic of Korea swiftly brought the coronavirus under control within its borders and returned to economic growth. I know it has still been a challenging time, but your experience shows the difference that leadership can make. As everyone at this conference knows, the subject of leadership has been much debated and discussed in the United States in recent months. And with the presidential election coming to a conclusion here next Tuesday, there is no doubt that we are at a critical moment, not only for the future of my country, but also for the world. So this is an auspicious time to be having a discussion, as we are today, on changes in the international order. And it is an especially significant moment for me to address an audience focused on the future of the Korean Peninsula and the potential for deepening economic cooperation across Northeast Asia. 20 years ago this month, I became the first U.S. Secretary of State to negotiate directly with North Korea's leader. As many of you know, the immediate purpose of my trip to Pyongyang in October 2000 was to obtain a halt in the North's provocative missile programs. But I also had in mind a larger goal, to persuade Kim Jong-il to end his country's isolation and move toward a more normal relationship with the world. I met with Mr. Kim for many hours, and we disagreed on almost everything, but I was encouraged that he at least seemed aware of the need for change. He spoke respectfully of South Korea and expressed a desire for better relations with the United States. He was also plainly searching for a new economic model because communism had been exposed as a failure. He hoped to trade military concessions for a combination of economic help and security guarantees, a deal that would have made the Korean Peninsula less tense and the world less dangerous. Sadly, such an arrangement did not become a reality. Time ran out on the Clinton administration, and our successors declined to pick up the negotiations where we had left off. Yet another reminder that U.S. elections have consequences. The North Koreans responded to this change in direction by unfreezing their stocks of plutonium, kicking out international inspectors, conducting a series of provocative tests, and in recent years, developing enough advanced missiles and nuclear arms to pose a serious threat to the world. This led to the crisis that the summits between President Trump and Kim Jong-un were meant to address. I welcomed the decision of the two leaders to try a diplomatic approach, but I'm not surprised that it failed to lead to a breakthrough. For years, the South has proposed friendship only to be greeted by suspicion and hostility, while the United States has offered security guarantees only to be confronted by security threats and broken promises. Under these circumstances, I have said and still believe that our leaders should pursue a diplomatic strategy that emphasizes cooperation, not so much with North Korea as toward North Korea. We need a high degree of coordination among policymakers, not only in Seoul and Washington, but also in Tokyo, Beijing, and Moscow in responding to the problems posed by Pyongyang. To have the best chance of success, our approach must be pragmatic, but it should also be based on certain principles. We should insist that North Korea comply with global norms. We should be patient. We should always bear in mind the humanitarian needs of the North Korean people. And finally, we should leave open the door to improved relations. This may not happen soon, but the best way to prepare for such a prospect is for South Korea and its friends, including the United States, to remain united in purpose and policy. Historically, we know that the United States and the Republic of Korea have viewed certain events differently, but we also know that our alliance has helped both countries to become stronger and to live in freedom and peace. Looking ahead, it is vital that our cooperation continue on matters of security, diplomacy, and prosperity. The United States should never become an obstacle to the reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula or deeper economic integration across Northeast Asia, but neither should America ever abandon its ally. In turn, I am confident that South Korea will do its part by further strengthening its democracy and by upholding global norms as it pursues important new initiatives such as Northern Economic Cooperation. As we head towards 2021, we know we will be operating in a world transformed by the coronavirus pandemic and the results of the presidential election in the United States. While much will change, depending on the outcome of the election, I believe the international agenda will be dominated by three main goals: recovery, sustainability, and balance. These objectives are both timely and interrelated. Recovery is essential to renewed growth, but recovery will not last if it is based on too narrow a foundation. To endure, recovery must include a broad range of economic sectors, including critical investments in renewable energy, and extend to each corner of the globe. It must harness the contributions of many and yield dividends to all. And it must achieve balance by protecting the benefits globalization brings while recognizing the need for countries to protect their health, their security, and their values. There is a danger, of course, that we may fail to achieve that balance. Instead of highlighting the need for global teamwork, an every nation for itself approach could take hold on matters such as trade, energy prices, refugees, climate change, the regulation of communications technology, and more. But as the pandemic wanes, my hope is that citizens everywhere remember that the most urgent challenges we face transcend borders and cannot be dealt with by any nation acting alone. Aside from disease, these perils include violent extremists, novel weapons technology, cyber pirates, and environmental catastrophe. As a global leader in technology, health, and science, and as a country that prioritizes diplomacy, the Republic of Korea can help foster the kind of international cooperation we need. For decades, experts have pointed to your country as a model of how a nation can move from widespread poverty to relative prosperity in the space of a generation. To those who say that economic cooperation to foster development does not work and that weak economies can never become strong, we reply, look at South Korea. The respect that you have earned enables you to serve as a bridge between industrialized and developing nations and between old economies and new. And that is yet another reason why I believe that the United States and the Republic of Korea must cooperate on policies that will make balanced and sustainable growth more likely, while recognizing that prosperity can only endure if it is widely shared. Often, when I speak to different audiences around the world. I am asked whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist. My reply is that I'm an optimist who worries a lot. Today, the causes for worry are evident. In fact, they are all around us. But I'm still an optimist because I believe in the power of reason, I have faith in democracy, and I have respect for the capacity of free people working together to achieve miracles, even in the most complicated circumstances. On that hopeful note, I will conclude my remarks, and with gratitude for your warm welcome and kind attention here this morning, and I thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Madam Albright, for your crisp, very informative, and heartful remarks. We'll have a time for discuss further. Let's turn to Dr. Krugman. He talked about issues titled The Pandemic and the World Order. Please.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to virtually attend this conference. I'm very appreciative, and I'm honored by the company on this panel. I'm going to talk, I'm going to talk about COVID at the end, but I want to, I think, in a way, following on what Secretary Albright had to say, the crucial thing to understand now is that we can move forward on the international economic order, but it's going to have to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of cooperative work. To a degree, an important degree, the order that we had until very recently was one that still relied upon the United States as being a kind of hegemonic power. And we are not going to be in a position to play that role. The United States will have to play a crucial role, but we're going to need the help of other countries, including very much Asian economies, including very much China, to make this thing work again the way it was supposed to. So I'm going to actually do this with a brief slideshow. So if you'll forgive me for inflicting a PowerPoint on you, I'm going to do that. It's, I believe, helpful to just have a bit of quantitative illustration of where we are. So the question is the pandemic and the world order, but let me just first start by saying that what we built and what we had in existence just a few years ago was really one of the most extraordinary economic and political, if I may say, successes of human history. We built a world economy that was remarkably open, not totally open, but one in which there were well understood rules that almost everybody adhered to, which created the possibility of a level of international integration that had never been seen before. And just this is a slide, a picture that many of us look at, which is a measure of how big is world trade relative to the world economy. And of course, there was a terrible period between the two world wars when international trade fell off. Lots of other things happened as well, but in particular, we became a world of largely closed borders and protectionism. We reconstructed a lot of that previous economy by the 1980s, and then something truly remarkable happened, which was this explosion of global trade, made possible in part by new technologies, fancy technologies like the internet, but also prosaic technologies like containerization, which turns out to be an enormously important thing. As it turns out, South Korea led the way in taking advantage. It was the South Korean takeoff of the 1960s that actually showed that this increasingly open, rules-based global economy offered unprecedented possibilities for economic development. And South Korea went from a subsistence economy to an advanced economy in an incredibly short period of time. It's a role model for the world. It is, as the Secretary said, it's a demonstration of what can be accomplished. But it wasn't, South Korea wasn't alone, after some length of time, we saw a general shift. We went from a situation in which it was not only advanced, traditionally wealthy countries that integrated with each other, but increasingly developing countries took advantage, threw themselves open to the world, shifted to becoming export economies. I just thought it would be interesting to give you a picture of just how much change we've had in this past 30 years, where countries like Brazil and India went from being very inward-looking, very closed economies that really didn't participate in the opportunities offered by the world. This is a transformative. It has meant that we are really part of a global economy, and it's a global economy that, in a way, the United States created in its own image. That is, we are a society, or were a society, very much driven by laws, by rules. And we created a set of rules under which countries could negotiate trade agreements and then be constrained to continue to obey those agreements. But remarkably, the United States, although very much, for much of this period, the dominant economic power, obeyed its own rules. So we did not behave like dominant powers of the past. We behaved in a, I wouldn't say totally altruistic way. There were many terrible things done, but the United States was a power for good in the world. However, the position of the United States as a kind of hegemonic power has been slowly eroding. This is not a bad thing. This is actually a testament to the success of our policies. I mean, the United States, I'm sure that Secretary Albright would know, the United States believed, going back to the days of Cordell Hull, who worked for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that growing trade meant economic growth, meant peace was a good thing for the world, and we have been successful in the sense that we've seen a great deal of economic development around the world, not just the traditionally rich countries, but spread. But that also means that the U.S. dominance of the world has been steadily eroding, not because we've done badly, but because other countries that started off poor have done so well. So China is not yet at market prices as big as the United States. Purchasing power parity is another question, but not really relevant for this discussion. But it's closing in quite rapidly, and so we now are in a situation where really there are three economic superpowers so far as world trade is concerned. There's the United States, there's the European Union, and there's China. And if you had asked me 5 years ago where I thought we were going, I would have been quite optimistic, because I would have said, look, the United States and the European Union share many of the same democratic values, share a commitment to the world system, and the European Union, whatever you may say about its disunity on many things, it does speak with one voice on international trade. So the idea was that we could have a co-dominion, if you like, of the world system by two rules-obeying entities, the United States and the EU, and that over time, China could be brought to play by the rules as well. So that China has been lagging. China's role in sustaining the system has lagged behind its power in the system, but we had hopes for changing all of that. What we've been through these past several years is something that I think none of us really predicted, which is that the great disruptive force, at least for the past few years, has been not the rise of new powers, but the fact that the original, the power that created this system, the hegemonic power, the power that had the great ability to exploit its position, but out of an enlightened view of its own self-interest, actually adhered to the rules, which was the United States, took a turn in the wrong direction. And so we've seen the United States move to trade war. Just a picture of this, just a reminder that we're not talking about small changes. The United States went from roughly 3% tariffs on Chinese goods to 20% tariffs in a very short period of time. Now, that's not to say that the United States was wholly in the wrong here. China is a very problematic player in the world system. There are major issues involving protection of intellectual property, major issues involving subsidies that, if properly accounted for, I would argue, would be clearly a violation of international trade rules. And so China does need to adjust its policy, and we probably do need, or we will need in future, to have some cooperative, basically an ultimatum delivered by countries that do obey the rules to China that says, look, you're a big boy now, you have to obey the rules as well. But that's not what happened. What we actually had was the United States operating unilaterally, and the United States operating in ways that, by and large, didn't violate the letter of international trade rules, but utterly violated the spirit. We were taking what were meant to be emergency, extreme policies to be adopted in extremis, and just exploiting them to do basically whatever the president wanted. So actually the most spectacular case is not one that involves China, but the idea that we imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada on the grounds of national security, which is fundamentally crazy, but not illegal. Unfortunately, it's within the prerogative. Certainly, it's within the prerogative of the U.S. president to do that, but it makes a mockery of the system. So we've had a problem in a way, a fundamentally lawless trade policy on the part of the United States. The good news there is that this is not reflecting a deep-seated rejection by the body politic in the United States of its international role. The remarkable thing in terms of the politics of trade policy is that the public in the United States is really not supporting this. This is not a mass movement. It's not a mass backlash against globalization. In fact, international trade is more popular in the United States than it has been basically since polling began. But because of the structure of our system, the president of the United States has enormous discretion to do these policies. It is likely, though not certain, that we will have a different president in a few months. And that will mean a big change in those policies, but that won't mean that everything goes back to the way it was, because no matter what else we do, the United States will be a country that could elect someone like Donald Trump and could do it again. So no one will ever trust the U.S. role in the world the way that we used to. And on top of that, we have... the United States had a double thing. We were the great power that behaved not, we weren't saints. We didn't behave perfectly, but we were the great power that behaved with more restraint, more adherence to the rules that we ourselves set than any great power ever has in history. We were also a power that everyone believed was remarkably competent. The United States could play a special role in the world because we were the country that knew what we were doing. COVID. This chart, by the way, since I had to submit it a week in advance, is already out of date. Things look substantially worse for the U.S. than you're able to see in this chart. The United States has been spectacularly unsuccessful at containing the coronavirus, in remarkable contrast to the miraculous success in South Korea. That damages. I mean, again, people will look at the United States and say, my God, you're supposed to be the country that knows what it's doing, but you can't actually control a pandemic. If we have a change in management in the United States, a lot of things will improve, but you don't really get to undo the fact that this history happened. We can't unscramble this egg. And what that means is not that the global system is doomed. Doesn't mean that nothing can work, but it means that the U.S. cannot bear as much of the load as it used to. What we need to move forward is we need a global system that is sustained on a multipolar basis. We need a lot of support certainly from traditional powers. We need the European Union to carry its weight. But we also need Asian powers. China obviously being the really big one, but Japan and South Korea, which is has become a very significant country, in part just because of what we see here. South Korea has demonstrated a remarkable ability to cope with crises, which gives it, I would argue, a level of reputational capital, if you like, moral force, that is disproportionate to the scale of its economy. And so the way forward, we do need to reconstruct this global economic system. The way forward is one that says, okay, hopefully the United States will be back to becoming a reasonable, responsible power, but it is not going to be able to play the role it did before. It's going to need a lot of help. We're going to really need to cooperate internationally to reconstruct the good things that we have managed to achieve up to this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It was extremely informative and very convincing in many ways. So if I sum up, to the key stance of two previous distinguished speakers is that Madame Albright is an optimist who worries a lot, and Dr. Paul Krugman was optimistic before, but not anymore, with some potentially good news with a lot of caveats. So these two presentations give plenty of food for thought. And now it's time to switch to our two other distinguished panelists. I would like to start by asking Professor Seong first about your expertise. So what economic cooperation would look like or should look like in the post-pandemic world, given changing international order or for the lack of a better word, as changing international order, as described by Secretary Albright and Professor Krugman. Professor Seong, could you share your thought on this point?
Yes. Yes. Firstly, it's my great honor to join these panels. And in my opinion, I think as regional cooperations is a new priorities now, and maybe in the next futures. And what's the reason for that? The two speaker already tell us about the background of these changes. And also, there is a lot of changes, for example, for the multilateral systems. It's very difficult after 2008. The multilateral negotiations is very difficult to move forward since then. And the reason for that, because the tariff for the industrial countries is already very low. And for the developing countries, it's difficult to reduce, to encourage the developing countries to reduce their tariffs. So it's difficult to compromise for the two different members. And another one is that it's the globalization processes in the last 30 and 40 years, just as Professor Krugman told us, since the 1980s, a lot of changes. But the consequence of the globalization is that a lot for the industrial countries is inequality in these countries. It's a development, and so there is a lot of changes for the support, the new policies support the globalizations even more. We see a lot of the changes. For example, in the United States, they not encourage anymore for the move out of the manufacturing capacities from USA to the outside world, and even encourage some of the capacity to come back to United States again. And the last one is that is just also the Professor Krugman mentioned about there is a rising of emerging countries, especially China. Because of these risings, there is a lot of the, for example, for the economic relation changes between China and the EU and the United States. And for the Trump administrations, there is, for example, for the trade war between China and the USA. So based on these changes, the new directions, especially for the corporations, is not based on the multilateral platform. It's for the regional one. And also in WTO, it's a plurilateral arrangement. It's also the priorities. So in my opinion, I think for these regions, for the nurse corporations, nurse corporation, I mean, it's mainly for Korea, Japan, China, Russia, and Central America, Central Asian countries, and of course, and maybe we include United States. For these regions, I think morely, maybe bilateral collaborations after the pandemic is the most important because a lot of countries suffer a lot because of the pandemic. So the recovery for their economies, maybe the favorite policy choices for the government. So the bilateral cooperations, for example, based on resource and energy, is maybe a good choice for us. Why for that? Because for these regions, we have a lot of the demanders from the Japan's, from Korea, from China, and also maybe from the United States for resource and energies. And on the other hand, for Central Asian and Russia have a lot of resource and energy there. So this maybe is a priority for these regions after the pandemic. And another one is that is for the cooperations among these regions, maybe not only for the bilateral cooperations, but also the regional cooperations is maybe is in the near future is new good choices. For example, for the RCEP models, maybe is good example for us because for these models, we know that there is 10 plus 1, 5 10 plus 1 FTA agreement there. So they emerged this 5 10 plus 1 FTA agreement together. Then they have the from the bilateral platform to the regional platform. So I think for these regions, North regions, we first can have bilateral arrangement, and then from bilateral to the regional corporations. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Seong, for your very thoughtful and suggestion for new way of looking at or search for the paradigm away from multilateralism or Bretton Woods system, you can call it, and stress the importance of the bilateral and the regional negotiation and the cooperation. We can talk about that a bit later. Before that, let's turn to Chairman Dvorkovich. Given, in this context, but given your expertise on more entrepreneurship, innovation, I would like to ask a question about economic cooperation rather than international order. Of course, you can feel free to comment on other things as well. What, in your view, should be right strategies for deepening economic cooperation in the region, maybe not the world, under the changing international order? And how Russia could help on this, if you can say?
Thank you. Thank you for this question, and it's an honor to be with you this night or morning or day, whatever the time of the day it is for any of you. It's been fascinating to listen to the opinions of my colleagues, and while I share lots of those views, especially regarding break in the trend in global trade and creation of more barriers and trend for trade wars. I think it's very unfortunate that this year with the pandemic it's getting even worse with countries having even higher motivation to be self-isolated and to create economic islands to preserve the security, both economic and health security in each particular country. And all countries did stuff almost in the same way. Maybe besides China, that had a completely different stance, starting the pandemic, but then isolating itself from the global pandemic by both strict discipline and other measures. But overall, it's very unfortunate that we have this trend. At the time when we need more solidarity, at the time when we need a real collaboration. And I remember very well the situation around 12 years ago when I worked as a Sherpa for both G8 and G20. And when we had those anti-crisis summits in Washington, London, Pittsburgh, and then in 2010 we had the G20 summit in Seoul, where we discussed ways for the future economic collaboration and trade, the expansion of trade. And China was gradually moving towards this rule-based system. Russia was moving also towards this rule-based system. And we've been at the final stage of discussing the terms of trade in the WTO framework. Now nobody cares about WTO, unfortunately. It's a completely different time. Hopefully we will care again about WHO, health organization, since it's the only tool to promote the collaboration in health. But answering your question, it's crucial to have a solidarity approach with the participation of both regional and global players, United States, China, Japan, Russia, and maybe a few other countries, if we are really serious about the improvements in the Korean Peninsula. Of course, South Korea did a lot to improve the situation, and Russia was trying to find economic motivation for the North Korea to be more cooperative, in particular using the infrastructure projects to facilitate the dialogue. One area is new railroad infrastructure that can connect the region, and Russia is still ready and eager to be an active part of this project. Of course, China can play a big role as well. The second is the power network, power grid that can connect Russia, northeastern China, and the whole Korean peninsula into one integrated power grid system. So those kinds of infrastructure projects can really work to integrate this small but very important region and alleviate political pressures. But to achieve that, we need trust. Trust is crucial, and it's again coming back to what we started with. Unfortunately, we have been losing trust during the last 4 years. Trust in the US role, trust in institutions, global institutions, and trust in possibility of successful partnership. There was a bright moment during this period, the Olympic Games, the Winter Olympic Games in Pyeongchang, where we had the united Korean team. I thought it's a very good moment to move forward with a much better collaboration, but we lost the momentum after the Olympics. That was really unfortunate. Summarizing this, I think we should look back in 2008 in terms of how we started working together, and with a clear understanding that China actually did a lot during this 12-year period to move towards a system where trade rules, economic collaboration rules really work. And we should not repeat what China didn't do. We should try to understand what China did actually to be an active part of this fight and be much more patient. And we should try to reestablish this trust in positive intentions rather than using economic instruments as weapons to preserve economic domination, like for instance, European Union is trying to do with the carbon tax. There is a good intention in green economy, climate policy, but the weapon is used not for that. The weapon is used to preserve self-economic interests, unfortunately. So re-establishing trust, moving forward with positive intentions to promote both regional and global economic cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dvorkovich. Thank to you. Now our talks now naturally gravitate to one of the common issues, the Korean Peninsula. You didn't mention six-party talk, but Korean Peninsula, cooperation, China, Russia, U.S., around to the Korean Peninsula to secure the peace, prosperity, railways, infrastructure. Green energy is now our talks become more concrete. So this, I think, naturally also link us back to Secretary Albright with the matter, more concrete matter about relations between U.S. and Russia. Madam Albright, some question. I have two questions, but let's come with the first one. Now, everybody is anticipating what could happen next Tuesday. So, hypothetically, under a Biden presidency, could you share your thought about the possible U.S.-Russia relations, assuming that the incumbent lose the election?
Let me just say I do not speak for Vice President Biden. These are my views, but I really do think that the U.S. approach to Russia has been fundamentally contradictory under the Trump administration, because in many ways, Trump has refused to criticize Russia and has shown a lot of warmth and deference towards Vladimir Putin, and even as some senior officials in the administration and leaders from both parties in Congress have been actually imposing some fairly tough sanctions. And so they're about what Russia, in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and interference in our elections. Now, the Biden administration, I think, would expect this contradiction to go away, but I really do think that there is going to be a fairly consistently tough policy towards Russia, because I think that President Biden wouldn't be reluctant to criticize Russia in areas where we disagree, such as on human rights, for instance, in Ukraine, and to protect the integrity of our elections. But at the same time, I am convinced that a Biden administration would be looking for areas of cooperation, and very encouraged by some of the recent things that have been going forward in terms of the nuclear arms agreements, in terms of continuing a New START, as well as looking at INF again. And then I think if there were a way for us to be able to resolve together some of the humanitarian crisis in Syria, for instance. So I can see areas where we can cooperate, but I don't think that a Biden administration is going to take lightly some of the things that have been going on in terms of what is visibly Russia's effort to separate us from our democratic allies plus democracy. And let me just say, I don't wish to go back and just think about the past, but what was interesting was the extent to which during the Clinton administration, we were trying to develop a functional relationship with Russia. You were talking about the G8, Mr. Chairman Vortovich. You know, I think that there were attempts. We disagreed on things. By the way, I personally met with Yeltsin to say that whatever we were doing with NATO was not against Russia. And at some point, we hoped that Russia could be a part of the NATO system. So, but there have been misunderstandings, I think, and some of our history leads us to continue our misunderstandings. And so I wish that there were a way for us to build on the things that we can do together.
Thank you. Thank you for your insight. One more for you, if we may. This is also one from the audience as well. Could you tell this is about China? Could you also tell us about what would be the outlook for economic cooperation between U.S. and China in coming years, and what could be done more to improve the relations, mostly I think economic relations, although it's quite complicated, including something could be done by mid-sized democracy like Korea?
Well, first of all, let me say, again, having been through a period that the Clinton administration was thinking about was how to have greater cooperation with China. We are the ones that suggested that China become a member of the WTO, really thinking that if it were part of an international system, there would be certain ways of looking at what one does about intellectual property or how we work with each other in terms of a variety of trade possibilities. But I have to say that there has been a great deal of disappointment, and it started in previous administrations in the way that China was operating internationally. And so there has been a sense of betrayal, I have to say, in that particular part. I do think, and I'm sorry to say this, but I see that tensions between the United States and China are not going to go away. They are bipartisan tensions. And though I think that Vice President Biden has a different approach to the way things should be done, it is very hard to say that all of a sudden we're going to wish away the tensions. And part of it does have to do because of Chinese approach towards human rights and the actions in terms of what have happened with the Uyghurs and Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I think there will also continue to be a bipartisan consensus about some decoupling of the technology sector, as in the U.S. national interest, as the country grapples with very important complexities of protecting data and managing social media and advancing cybersecurity. I do think that politically, the realization is that the U.S. has allowed itself to become too dependent on certain supply lines in China, and it's going to continue to be a driver in a particular way. I do think, however, that there are areas that we have to find to collaborate, because part of the issues that we're dealing with know no borders. Climate change knows no borders, viruses know no borders. And I think also that here is a place that the Republic of Korea can play a very helpful role as we can collaborate on the supply chain resilience and technology development, as well as the kinds of things that we have in common in wanting to have a peaceful part of the world. One of the things that did happen in the Obama administration, which was the rebalancing to Asia, to really spend more time thinking about that we are a Pacific power as well as an Atlantic power, and that it is important for us to have functional relationships. I do think the relationship with the Republic of Korea is one of the most important ones. I really believe that. We have been allies. We have a great deal in common in terms of our support for democracy and economic development. I think we have in common that we would like to see a united and peaceful peninsula, and we would like to have functioning relationships with the neighbors. And so I think that it is viewed by most of the policy people that I know that the relationship with the Republic of Korea is one of the keystones and a very important one in a vital area. And I do think that this kind of a conference allows there to be real discussions about how the private and public sector can work together to achieve some of those goals.
Thank you very much for sharing your insight about this very complicated, difficult issue. And we take note that things might not change overnight, but maybe things get even worse in the meantime. But there is a certain role Korea could play in this area to establish and retain functional relationship between two powers. So I think now, moving to the next one, I believe that this goes to Professor Krugman about supply chains. Let's assume that Madam Albright is right, and there is no much improvement in U.S.-China or U.S.-Russia relationship in the short term. Assuming that could stay, we would like to ask your opinion about the future of supply chains in Asia, which rely heavily on trade in and outside the region, while global trade system might not be functioning as good as before. Could you share some of your thought about it?
Sure. I think the first thing to say is that we're obviously obsessed with the coronavirus, which it turns out has very little direct impact on supply chains. Essentially, container ships are not a vector, not an important vector for disease transmission. So that the mechanics of elaborate supply chains are not particularly affected. One thing that remains very uncertain, we don't know yet, is how much the movement of people is going to be affected. And it seems likely that for an extended period of time, quite possibly years, maybe even permanently, the freedom of movement of individuals will be reduced. People will be reluctant to take long plane flights, and that is going to be somewhat of an inhibitory effect on complex supply chains. Essentially, the ability of the vice president for production to fly out to the plant in Guangzhou and talk to people. And how important is that in facilitating these global supply chains? And it must make some difference. There's enough circumstantial evidence that suggests that the ability to have frequent personal contact matters, and that's going to be much reduced. So there will be some inhibition of supply chains. On top of that, we will have the uncertainty. The fact of the matter is we will never restore the level of certainty in the continuation of trade policies that we had before. Even if the tariffs that have been imposed in the U.S.-China trade war are ramped way back down, everyone will henceforth know that they can come back. And that will be an inhibiting factor. There will be more investment close to home, more and less dependence on supply chains. So we're probably likely to see some crimping of the hyperglobalization. The fact of the matter is we were already seeing that. It looks in the data as if the really dramatic expansion of world trade to unprecedented levels was largely a one-time phenomenon, roughly from 1990 to 2010, and leveled off thereafter. It was not the case that we were moving towards ever more global fragmentation of production, and we probably will see some backsliding. There will be not catastrophic unless things go much worse than I expect they will. But we are probably looking for a world where there will be some deglobalization taking place, some return towards local production, which is going to be problematic. I mean, it's even a advanced country like Korea will suffer somewhat from the degradation of this vertically disintegrated global economy that we now have, but much more so countries that are just on the way up. I would say that the environment over the next 10, 15 years is going to be less favorable for the up-and-coming countries. It's going to be less favorable for Vietnam. It's going to be less favorable for Bangladesh than one might have hoped. Nothing doesn't look catastrophic. It doesn't look like a Smoot-Hawley tariff world where trade is really shut down, but it is going to be a world where the big gains that we had over the period from 1990 till 2010 or a little bit later are not likely to be repeated.
Thank you. I share your view that actually the trade, our performance of global trade, global growth, that was more of the one-time phenomena, which I think you mentioned one of your article back in 1990s. So let's see how that evolved. I think this looks like we are closing to the end of our time together. There was a lot of conversation on trade, supply chains, international relations, whether bilateral, regional, multilateral, and the possible strategies for cooperation and collaboration in the region. I hope that today's session will lead us to deeper understanding of the issue and hope that more discussion to go forward. Thank you very much for speaking in today's session late at night and also very early in the morning with excellent insight into changing international order. And I think a key takeaway is that the critical importance of more, not less, economic cooperation in this changing world to secure peace and prosperity in this part of the world so that we do not see the repeat of what happened here 70 years ago. With all that, please join me thanking all our panel for taking time today, especially in this difficult time. And I would like to also thank you, people coming here offline and joining through online. We really appreciate your time and interest in Northern Economic Cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Albright.
Thank you once again to Chairman Kwon as acting as our moderator, as well as all of the panelists. Please give them another big round of applause. And now that concludes our special session, ladies and gentlemen. We will be back with our business session later on. Thank you very much. 네, 고맙습니다. 오차는 저희 지금부터 1시 30분